Thank you. My name is Bill Smith. I'm the director of the Borah Foundation here on campus, and on behalf of the foundation and the committee, we thank you for coming out tonight. My role tonight is brief. I'm to say a few words and then introduce a committee member who will further the introduction of our keynote speaker. I do want to wish a meaningful Yom Kippur to our Jewish friends who may be celebrating tonight. Thank you. And then to say that this is my 24th annual symposium with the foundation. And one of the real strengths of the Borah at the University of Idaho is that unlike international relations symposia at other universities, this one's planned from an interdisciplinary perspective. We have 6 faculty, 6 students, and 2 staff members from a wide scope of the university who come together and talk about these issues, not because they're specialists per se on these topics, but because these topics are important to Idahoans and to other citizens on the Palouse. So therefore, it can't just be specialists who talk about these topics. One of the other things that's unique about our committee this year is that Dakota Robeson, who's going to introduce our keynote speaker, is part of our far-flung faculty in Idaho Falls. To my knowledge, he's the first committee member from one of our branch campuses to serve on the Borah committee, and that's additionally exciting. Finally, I'd like to say that we'll have a robust conversation. We'll try and keep Q&A to an exciting 20 minutes or so, and then encourage folks to stay around and converse. We will be recording for people to access later, but there is no simulcast of tonight's proceedings. But without further ado, then let me introduce Dakota Robeson to introduce our keynote speaker. Dakota.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Before I begin, the Borah Foundation Committee wishes to thank the President's Office, the Office of the Provost, and the Martin Institute for their support of this year's symposium. And I'd also like to remind you of our upcoming events, which were projected here previously, but they're not here. So hopefully you've got your program in front of you. I'll just give you a quick refresher where they are and when. So 12:30 p.m. tomorrow in the Vandal Ballroom of the Pittman Center here, we have the Renfrew Colloquium entitled Updating Senator Borah, a Nuclear Kellogg-Briand Pact, presented by Dave Koplow, the Scott K. Ginsburg Professor of Law at Georgetown University Law Center. Then at 7 p.m. at the Kenworthy Theater, there'll be a screening of the documentary Putin's Attack on Ukraine, Documenting War Crimes. Finally, at 7 p.m. on Wednesday, in the International Ballroom at the Pittman Center, I think that's just down the hallway from here. Oh, it's this room. No. My geographies, but as Dr. Smith mentioned, I live in Idaho Falls, so forgive me for my being turned around here. So back here at 7 p.m. on Wednesday in the International Ballroom of the Pittman Center, a plenary address will be given by Dirk Kempthorne, former senator and governor of Idaho and Secretary of the Interior. So tonight, the reason we're here is the University of Idaho professor of journalism, Kenton down here. He's going to sit down with Dr. Fiona Hill for a fireside chat. Dr. Hill is a distinguished senior fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings Institution and the Chancellor of Durham University, UK. Dr. Hill is not only an expert in Russian and European affairs, but also a civil servant of the highest order, having served in 3 presidential administrations. Fiona and I first crossed paths while working in the White House at the National Security Council. The story of our serendipitous meeting outside of Ike's, a small cafeteria in the basement of the White House complex, is worth sharing as a glimpse into what truly motivates her. It was early, maybe 7 a.m., during one of those quiet moments when the heavy marble corridors in the White House basement seemed to hold their breath in anticipation of the day's events. The proverbial calm before the storm. As I began my 3rd day on the job, I dropped by to grab a cup of coffee and found myself in deep conversation with Fiona, who just so happened to be starting her 3rd to last day at the NSC. So as she was on her way out, I was on my way in. And we pulled up a small table next to this grand spiral staircase, and we spoke about the gravity of the day ahead, the weight of the decisions to be made, and the state of American civics. And from that first conversation, it was clear that Fiona is a true public servant at heart, inspired by a unique life experience and perspective. In particular, her faith in strong institutions to mold and create the next generation of leaders still sticks with me today. She explained that good institutions demand something of you. They take you in, they mold you, and they shape you into something which the whole of society benefits. Universities, of course, take in those looking for reason, knowledge, and context. The Peace Corps, for example, gives meaning to those who seek it. The Marines can take in a listless teen and give him purpose and discipline. Such civic institutions, she observed, need our constant attention and renewal. And so while our overlap at the NSC was short, we still find time to discuss the roles that we all play in taking care of these institutions that shape us. As you'll see, she's not just a brilliant foreign affairs mind, but also a person of immense integrity and kindness, someone whose impact goes far beyond her professional accomplishments. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Fiona Hill.
I think we're on, right?
Check, check.
Yep, very good. Excellent.
Well, good evening, everyone. And it's an honor for me to share the stage with our guest. I first attended a Borah Symposium in this room not quite 50 years ago as an undergraduate student at the U of I. And so this is like coming full circle to be able to take the stage with such a distinguished guest. It's also significant that this talk is labeled a fireside chat because Franklin Roosevelt's first fireside chat took place 90 years ago, March 12, 1933, when he addressed the nation by radio about the Emergency Banking Act. And so as a scholar of media history, it's appropriate that I have the opportunity to perhaps inherit part of FDR's mantle. So, Dr. Hill, let's begin with the theme of this symposium, World on the Edge, Future of International Cooperation. Can you give our audience a snapshot of a World on the Edge, September 25th, 2023?
Well, thank you very much, Kenton, and also to Dakota for the very kind introduction. I was wondering, was I really that eloquent at 7 o'clock in the morning before I'd had my coffee? But anyway, thank you very much for certainly making me sound that way. And I'm actually quite glad that we're not quite at the edge of the stage, given the topic tonight, because, just before I came in here, I was just catching up on some of the news, and I don't know whether everybody else has been, looking at this. And the Ukrainians are claiming that they've killed the commander of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which is, the kind of event that if this is in fact the case, a year or so ago we could possibly never have contemplated, and would certainly get a lot of people on the edge, because this was as a result of an attack on the Black Sea Fleet's headquarters in Crimea in Sevastopol. And of course lots of people were speculating, as the war has unfolded in Ukraine, that any kind of attack on Crimea would elicit a very serious Russian response, which will put a lot of people on edge now, wondering what's going to happen next. And, very sadly, where we are, as you said, here in September 2023, is at a period, although a lot of the discussions at the Borah Symposium are going to be focused on war in Ukraine, with the documentary that you'll be showing, and then, the larger discussions of international law, on obviously conflict, and Senator Borah was of course someone who famously wanted to end an outlaw war, which was a very noble ideal, and of course this was after the mayhem of World War I, and he sadly passed away in 1940, although perhaps fortunately, because he didn't live to see the United States dragged into World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor. But all of this repetition of war, 100-year cycle of wars in Europe, is also colliding with major international crises. climate change and climate disasters, which are certainly notable around the world. Very fast demographic change. I was talking to someone earlier about thinking who would have thought, and perhaps who would have thought if you were sitting here 50 years ago as an undergraduate, that the world would go from 2 billion people to 8 billion people. And just the kind of implications of that, a milestone which I'm not sure we should be quite commemorating or celebrating, that we passed relatively recently. Also, very fast, rapid technological change. And all of the concerns. I was meeting with students earlier who were asking about, where are we headed with AI? For example, I'm sure that's another of the themes that will spin themselves out over in the Borah Symposia in the future. And it certainly feels like, with the title that you've picked, that we're in one of these apocalyptical moments. But I would suggest, as a historian, we've been there before many times. Senator Borah's whole experience as the person that this commemorates, he would have felt the same, for sure, back in the 1920s when he was part of the Kellogg-Briand Pact, trying to stabilize a world that certainly seemed on the edge and out of control. But the war in Ukraine is a system-changing event. I've actually called it in some other discussions, which probably doesn't make people feel very comfortable, World War III, but in the sense of the fact that it's one of those events where you realize that everything has shifted completely. The United States' position in the world has shifted. Many of the countries that look at what's happening in Ukraine do so through the prism of their own feelings about the United States, including many commentators here in the US. Somehow the United States provoked this war, despite the fact that it's Vladimir Putin who decided to invade, certainly not the United States. The United States has, as many times before, been pulled in to a conflict one way or another. The rest of the world outside the United States wonders why they should care about Ukraine when there are other conflicts going on. There are coups in Niger, in Sudan, for example. There is an even more brutal conflict in Ethiopia, where many more people have died than in Ukraine. But Ukraine has raised the specter of famine, of the shortages of wheat, particularly important from sitting here from the perspective of Idaho, one of the wheat capitals of the world, thinking of Ukraine as an ancient breadbasket of Europe and the Black Sea and Mediterranean region. But also it's shown that our systems of deterrence, the very things that Senator Borah was trying to put in place, have failed completely. Vladimir Putin was not deterred or dissuaded whatsoever from invading Ukraine. And again, one of the subjects that we're going to be talking about, or one of our colleagues is going to be talking about, because he's in possession of nuclear weapons. And Dakota, coming in from the other part of the University of Idaho, where all of the research is done on nuclear energy and the whole nuclear arena, it's obviously a very sobering thought. We are on edge because Putin has proven to be so feckless, at least in his discussion of the use of nuclear weapons, turning all the whole ideas of nuclear deterrence on their head. I'll stop there, but it's pretty obvious why we're on the edge. It's a very good title. But I would just also say that there is also some room for optimism here, just so we can move along with everybody sitting on the edge of their seat and wondering where we're all headed.
Well, let's continue with the legacy of this symposium's namesake, William Borah, whose foreign policy was defined by isolationism. And he resisted proposals to involve the United States in the war in Europe, even as the threat of Nazi Germany to European democracies was evident in the last year of his life. So what are the lessons for Americans today from the opposition that Borah and others who were adamantly opposed to going to Britain's aid in the early years of World War II, and then implying those examples for today? How should we respond to the neo-isolationists in Congress who oppose the U.S. aid to Ukraine?
Yeah, well, look, it's a great question, and it's actually a very apt framing and the way that you've laid this out, and also thinking of Senator Borah directly. Because as you've just alluded to, there was a great deal of resistance in the United States to actually supporting Great Britain, my original country, in that period from 1939 up until Pearl Harbor. In fact, at different points, 90% of the American public, insofar as polling was as sophisticated as it is now, I mean, you probably wouldn't have had telephone polls, to the same, degree that you have now. But insofar as the polls were reasonably accurate of public sentiment, about 90% of Americans at different points were completely opposed, supporting Britain, even notwithstanding the invasion of France and all of the, Dunkirk and all of the problems and, the ties of Churchill. We've made a lot of comparisons of late between Volodymyr Zelensky and Winston Churchill. Obviously, two very different individuals, but also, two people who were, had a lot of ties and networks and were really trying to represent their countries and keep, the United States engaged and, other, in the case of Zelensky, other European partners. But of course, Senator Borah was coming out of a long tradition of isolationism in the United States. We all think back to George Washington, not that we were there, we're not all that old, but George Washington actually came from my home area in Northern England. Washington, County Durham, was the seat of his family before his family left to other places and then eventually ended up in the United States. And of course, he warned against foreign entanglement. So it's been a perpetual theme for the United States, particularly as a country that was wresting itself away from an over burdensome and tyrannical empire, being the British Empire of the time. But even then, rooted in American history and thinking back to George Washington, the United States wouldn't have been able to establish itself as an independent country without the assistance of other countries. I'm just making a couple of links here with Ukraine, which underscores the difficulty of trying to stay aloof from foreign affairs. Inevitably the Brits came back again. It was the famous, we weren't too far away from the White House with the British attempt to burn it down again in the 1800s. I always felt a bit embarrassed walking past those scorch marks. They leave them there deliberately, I think, just for British visitors and to go, that's where the Brits tried to burn the White House down. Scott, you could have painted over it, I think it was kind of a bit of a paint job, but it's a healthy reminder that independence, often has to be fought for, repeatedly. Also, Putin and the Russians are also talking about, because we've got Crimea in mind and this, bombing of the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. And it's not that Crimea has been Russian since time immemorial. In fact, Crimea was annexed by Catherine the Great, happened to be a German, who then becomes empress. Complicated history in Russia as well, just like anywhere else. In the spring of 1783. It's not until September of 1783, for all of you who've studied American history, that the United States really becomes the United States with the Treaty of Paris, again, thanks to the French. But there's lots of parts of the United States that weren't part of the US, not least Idaho, that doesn't come along as a state until the 1890s. Canada was still British North America, so it takes a while for Canada to get its independence. And of course, places like Florida, Louisiana, because the Louisiana Purchase hadn't happened. Florida's still, these are territories and not states. So this is just also underscoring that every country goes through lots of iterations. So Russia's claim on Crimea, is disputable. It wasn't recognized, like with the Treaty of Paris, as the United States was later on in that year. And the United States, in keeping with its tradition as a country that wrested its freedom from an empire, we've made all kinds of undertakings to countries like Ukraine in the past. And in 1994, the United States, along with the United Kingdom and also, frankly, Russia, acknowledged Ukraine's independence, territorial integrity and sovereignty when we pushed the Ukrainians, getting back to nuclear weapons again, to give up the nuclear arsenal that they'd inherited along with Belarus and Kazakhstan from the Soviet Union after its collapse. And we told the Ukrainians, we, the United States, along with the Brits and the Russians, that we gave that we would assure their territorial integrity and their sovereignty if anything happened. Well, obviously the Russians haven't kept to their part of the bargain, but that is kind of again another part of our responsibility as a state. You can't just give idle promises and wander off and pretend that isn't something that you're responsible for anymore. And countries do look to the United States. Again, this is one of the difficulties of trying to remain in isolation, that if you've given your word, you've given an undertaking, that one would expect you to stand up. The UK has actually stood up in that regard. It's one of the reasons the UK is all in on this conflict. The UK and British politicians are among the first to make those connections between Zelensky and Churchill. And there's a lot of discussion in Europe right now about the importance of standing up for Ukraine. So look, there's all kinds of other reasons as well why it's very difficult to be able to stand back when something happens, even though it's hard to think, and Senator Borah would probably be spinning around right now at the idea that not once but twice, but now 3 times, that the United States has been pulled into a conflict in Europe.
We'll come back to the Ukraine, but before we leave the theme of the symposium, if you could talk a little bit about any bright spots in terms of international cooperation. Are there places where international organizations are actually working together? Are we making progress in areas other than trying to keep countries from fighting with each other, but just in terms of cooperation on economic or health or social issues?
Well, look, there are a lot, and I mean that's why I would say that there is a lot of room for optimism. And a lot of these things are disputed because of our politics, but there is a kind of a remarkable evidence, recent cooperation in the production of the vaccines for the coronavirus. I know there's a lot of people out there who worry about the speed in which they were produced, but they were produced on the back of decades and decades of international cooperation and research, and by a completely international group of scientists, including a Turkish woman emigre to Germany, people here in the United States working together, people in a multiplicity of countries pooling their knowledge. We did the same for smallpox and for polio. In the past, we talked about President Roosevelt and the fireside chats. He, of course, was a victim of polio. He came, into the world too early for the polio vaccine. I was one of the first people, perhaps you were the same, to have the polio vaccine as a young person. I also had the smallpox vaccine in the UK, and we thought of it, I know, ironically, as a privilege to have these vaccines back in the day, because so many of our forebears, got terrible infectious diseases. My grandmother was one of 10 surviving kids out of what had been 20 kids, many of whom died of infectious disease. And that's, my grandma was born in 1904, and in her whole lifetime, there was these dramatic changes. There's also all the cooperation on technology, the engineering school here, international cooperation, and I would also say the very nature of University of Idaho. In agriculture, I've been impressed by the exchanges that you have here in engineering and in other, fields. The public land grant universities were set up to, basically push forward research on critical issues related to agriculture and engineering now, technology. These are all the areas where we've seen, great cooperation and a search for solutions on very practical issues. And there's still, despite everything, a lot of faith around the world in, and I know again there'll be lots of eye rolls, in the United Nations, not in the United Nations Security Council, but in various mechanisms of the United Nations. For example, we've seen the International Atomic Energy Agency step in with the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant and at least try to stabilize the situation there. It hasn't been utterly successful, but the early efforts to create a Black Sea grain deal to break out of the blockade that Russia has imposed in the Black Sea on Ukrainian grain exports, that's foundered somewhat, but it was a big push by the UN Secretary General, humanitarian aid, and also then the private sector. I was in Boise just this last week, and on the way to the airport, I was rather surprised to see a big mural. There's lots of public art in Boise, and here's a big picture of Jose Andres, the celebrity chef. But Jose Andres is not just known for cool restaurants, but also for World Central Kitchen, which have managed to feed more people than any other entity out there. And what an incredible example of a private sector initiative that's really kind of inspired people to literally feed the world. So I think we've got lots of examples of collaborative, cooperative action. We just have to get over ourselves and all of the, the various fights that we have to be able to address issues. There's a lot of amazing human ingenuity out there.
Let's turn to a domestic issue, labor relations. The U.S. has seen perhaps more labor unrest this year than in several years. The Hollywood writers did settle over the weekend, but the actors are still on strike, still negotiating. But perhaps more significantly, the United Auto Workers have walked out in several places, and their work stoppages aimed at improving wages and working conditions. You've spent several months recently in Germany looking at the role of unions in helping to reduce political polarization. Tell us a little bit about that work and whether there might be some lessons for the United States and how to break down barriers between different political parties and factions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure for the audience that seems a little bit out of left field. You know, why were you doing this in Germany for the last several months? But on one front, obviously I've done a lot of this work over the years in Russia, but I'm now banned from Moscow, Russia, although I'm very happy to be here in Moscow, Idaho. I can't go back there. So thank you very much for having me here, is all I can say, right? Please don't ban me, from here next. And I'm trying to turn the lens of some of the work that I was doing in Russia on the breakdown of institutions. Dakota was remarking how we started talking about, the importance of institutions. Because, I've been really worrying for a long time that what's happened in Russia is the ghost of Christmas future for the United States and for other countries as well. And that, we, as citizens, we start to lose our voice. And, in Russia, I was very active working there. I was there as a student in the late 1980s and under Gorbachev as the whole place was opening up. And then in the 1990s, I was heavily involved in technical assistance projects and writing about Russia's transition and, the kind of efforts to create new institutions. And during the Soviet period, Russia had fake unions. And I just want to tell you just a kind of a weird story about how I started studying Russian. Because my father was a coal miner who left school at 14, and the coal mines on my area all closed down. He didn't get a chance, for further education. But the Durham Miners Association, which was a forerunner of the National Mine Workers Union, really tried to put a lot of effort into education for their members, but also for their children. The idea of bettering themselves through education. So I've always, very much been a benefit in this perspective of, associations or mine unions and other unions linked to, larger educational efforts. And in 1984, during the British miners' strike, which I'm sure people are very familiar with, it was the largest strike action in Britain since the 1926 general strike, and a similar strike action was then happening in the 1920s here in the United States. The miners' unions of the Soviet Union collected money for the miners of Britain. Now, we can be a bit skeptical about this, but my region of Britain was twinned with the Donbass, which of course is now in Ukraine, was always in Ukraine, but we'd have thought of that as one of the big Soviet mining regions. And I got £100 from money that had been given to the Durham Miners Association, ostensibly from the miners of the Donbass, to take my first Russian language course. So I'm brought to you here by the miners of Donbass. And that weighs heavily on me now, thinking about what's happened in Donbass. But this was kind of a remarkable achievement. And in the 1920s, representatives from the Durham Miners Association, including miners' wives who led these delegations, would go over and visit the Soviet Union, trying to get kind of an idea of what was happening in the coal fields of Donbass in particular. They all were a bit skeptical, let's just say, when they came back, particularly about whether these were actually real unions or not. But it's always stuck in my mind about the role of unions, for my family, which were focused not just on collective bargaining or going on strike, but as part of civic education. So the Durham Miners Association also invested heavily in workers' education. And I'm now the Chancellor of Durham University, which is quite ironic, in my home area, because the Durham miners would pool their money together. And this is their dues that they pay to the association. And they would rent a lecturer from Durham University, and they would put up a poster like this for the kind of Borah Symposium, and kind of basically advertise a lecture by a particular professor, but it would say, topic to be decided on at the lecture. I mean, can you imagine? Just like, showing up, you're a professor of engineering and you're going to be coming and asked about moral philosophy or something. So this is what the miners, it was very, kind of eclectic, and, they'd have these lecturers come there. So unions and associations played very different roles at different times. And, in Russia, they've totally disappeared. Mm-hmm. And so there's no voice, whatsoever of workers, kind of no participation. And in Germany, they have an idea of industrial citizenship, and many of you are probably familiar with this. So you have participation in civic life through your workplace. You can be a member of a union, or you can be also a member of an elected workers' council. And in Germany, increases in productivity and actually breakthroughs in workplace change have actually come from this combination of these workers' councils, which are very much tied into the businesses and the companies themselves, and then the unions. There's not so much of a contentious, relationship. Germany, in fact, has never really deindustrialized, and the unions have retained, a lot of influence. And the unions are now working with the German government and German businesses to kind of think about the future of work. And the auto workers, for example, in contrast with what's happening here, are working with the big manufacturers, Volkswagen, Mercedes, and others, trying to think about how they move all of the companies into this new world beyond the combustion engine. They will go on strike, if the various issues are not resolved, but they don't do that quite so frequently. The railway workers were on strike the whole time I was in Germany. There was a bit of a breakdown there, and also air traffic control, and and in Britain everybody was on strike, the whole time. I had to cancel several trips going to Britain. But there's this embedded idea that you play a role in civic life, but you also play a role in the big businesses and in the big corporations by participating in a union or a council is very interesting, because I think part of the problem in both the UK and the United States is that representative democracy, or people's sense of representative democracy, is broken down. People want to have a voice, but they don't have faith in the mainstream parties. It's definitely been the case in the UK, and would say the same here. And we're finding a new form of, I wouldn't call it trade unionism, because lots of people are not in the classic trades anymore, but people wanting to join unions. So, here in the United States, we all know baristas of Starbucks have tried to unionize, Amazon workers, the same's happening in the UK. Our interns and research assistants at Brookings have unionized. And in Germany, a lot of the unions are also now trying to figure out how they work with gig workers and others, casino workers. All the old standard auto workers, they've picked up casino workers, academics, from various disciplines as well, because they're all trying to figure out how to give people more of a role, more of a voice. So I think we're at a very interesting time. And, if we kind of think about this differently as people wanting to have more of a civic role, and this whole idea of industrial citizenship in Germany, Germany is a capitalist country. And 90% of industry in Germany is owned by families. So this is not, some socialist, paradise, that people might otherwise, think about. The unions play a very different role, and they've boosted productivity and actually helping, shape Germany's response to these very rapid technological and demographic changes. So I thought it was just very interesting to look into this and see if there's some, lessons for us here.
Well, I look forward to learning more about your observations and seeing ways that we might apply it to improve our civic dialogue here in the United States. But I wanted to return to your personal story, and you've given us just a little bit of your family background in the north of England. I think our audience, especially the students, would be interested in learning about some of the challenges that you faced to go from the north of England as a miner's daughter to the White House, to the national security staff. What were the steps along the way, and what strategies did you employ to get where you are today?
Well, look, I think, as I've already made clear by mentioning the Durham Miners Association, plus the strange funding from the miners of the Donbass, one of the major reasons that I'm where I am today is because of grants and assistance. And I've been really taken in my meetings with students over the last few days here about the real importance that institutions like the University of Idaho play as offering opportunities for people from all the way across the state. Also the role of Pell Grants as somebody who is not just first generation going to college, but my father didn't finish high school. He left at 14. He had no qualification whatsoever. There's also the importance of being able to learn other skills along the way. And I've taken on board from the experiences of education, opportunities, access to education, basically being able to go to university on the back of the equivalent of a Pell Grant from my local education authority. Also the importance of always having access as you go through your career to new educational opportunities. My father had no chance at retraining, but 20 years later, when my brother, who worked in a shipyard, lost his job, he was trained through, basically in the workplace training, but also through an entity in the United Kingdom called the Open University, which is again like an extension school. And I know that a lot of things like that are done here, also in the public and land grant universities, workers' education. Eventually, he ends up with a bachelor's of science and a master's in science, and moves from being an electrician in a shipyard to an electrical engineer, and now he's in charge of all the kind of mainframe maintenance for the big systems for Ministry of Defence and hospitals and banks for the whole of Northern England and Scotland. From previously a very different position, all because of the importance of academic training and also vocational training and getting new certification. So for me, whatever all the students here are doing and institutions like the University of Idaho are doing is opening up that opportunity. And then, look, it was a series of very fortuitous meetings and mentorship. All the way along my career, just like our chance encounter in Ike's, over a cup of coffee as I'm on my way out and you're on your way in, it would be a meeting with somebody who would actually take the time to talk to me. And I would ask about advice and they would give it to me. When I got to St Andrews University, in basically about 85, I thought maybe I'd made a huge mistake by deciding to study Russian. I'd made that decision because of the war scares of the 1980s, the Euro missile crisis, think we're all going to get blown up by a nuclear weapon, thinking maybe if I learned Russian, I could be a translator at an arms control negotiation, perhaps. I thought that was a very lofty goal. I had no idea I'd end up, doing any of the things that I'm doing here. But then, it kind of got into the 1980s, and I thought, oh my God, what if I don't get a job? All this money wasted. Oh, I really get a job with Russian and modern history. And I went to the career service and I thought I should switch subjects. Unemployment was really high. There was 90% youth unemployment in the UK at this time. My father had told me, there's nothing for you here. It's the title of the book. You need to go somewhere else. And I thought, I can't go back home with no job. My parents didn't even have a basement I could live in. It's like, what am I going to do? So I went in the career office, and they said, oh, okay, well, look, we have some alumni you could write to. And they gave me the address, and this is, old school, literally writing a letter by hand. For students, this seems unreal, kind of you can do it on LinkedIn, or I've told some students, link in with me, send me an email. And I'm literally having to write an old-fashioned letter to a man named George Robertson, who is a local member of parliament who'd been at St Andrews in Scotland. Well, George Robertson went on to be the UK Defence Minister and UN NATO Secretary General, but he wasn't any of these things in the 1980s, and he took the time to write back to me. He'd obviously dictated it to his secretary because it was typed, or maybe he typed it, but it was, it wasn't auto pen, it was a proper signature. And he gave me advice to stick at it, and he thought that things would change. He told me about this guy, Mikhail Gorbachev, who had kind of come in, and he thought that, things would really change in the Soviet Union. And he was sure that I would get a job, and he offered that I could write to him at any time, which I never did again. But I thought, well, I would actually, stick to this. But, fast forward multiple years, and I'm at Brookings, and we hosted him, for a talk like this, and I got the chance to thank him. Thank you, Mr. Robertson, for writing back. Of course, he had no recollection whatsoever. Probably thought I was making it up, but I, still had the letter. I didn't have it with me. It was back in a box in my mother's house, but it had made such a difference. And I think that's, the thing as well. Anybody out here can mentor someone. You can peer mentor. You can just take the time to talk to someone and give them your advice, because I would never have made any of these, career advancements without somebody giving me a hand along the way. It's a team effort. It's not just based on merit and hard work. It's often, somebody playing that really incisive, important role at a given time.
Let's turn to your book, which, as you mentioned, the title is inspired by your father's advice to you, "There's nothing for you here." What ideas from that book might be applicable, particularly to the rural regions of the American West that have perhaps been left behind by the booming economies on the coast, and how broadly can we Americans look for ways to strengthen our economy in a way that will empower all parts of the country and not just the Silicon Valley and the hot areas along the coast?
Well, there's a couple of things to this. So, I already mentioned there was sort of a 90% youth unemployment crisis when I was leaving school in 1984. It didn't mean that people didn't ever get a job. It just meant that when people left school, 90% had nothing else to go on to. And it would take them a while before they might find apprenticeship I had something to go on to because I got a place in university, and that's when my father said, "Well, there's nothing for you here, pet," he said. I took that out of the book title because people might think it was a book about dogs and cats or something, because it's a term of endearment in Northern England's pet, kind of thing. There's nothing for you here, pet. If you get a degree, you're going to have to go somewhere else. Because, when there is that limited, jobs, obviously education contributes to a brain drain. And, it's going to be very difficult to then, think about how you would come back again. There was a university close to my hometown. That is Durham University that I'm now the Chancellor of. But universities at that point in Britain really didn't play the kind of role that university like the University of Idaho plays here in terms of being really rooted in the community and in the state and generating particularly through agribusiness and agriculture and engineering, new jobs or new ideas that would benefit the kind of larger community. They were, very much more the ivory towers. And if people went to that kind of university, they were being, kind of trained to go off into a different field, and you'd end up leaving the region. And one of the things that I was looking at in Germany was the role of universities in transforming particular places, like place-based regeneration. So I would argue that Moscow, Idaho really benefits from having the University of Idaho here. That's a no-brainer, I think, for people who are sitting here. So what happened in Germany, in the Ruhr, for example, the Ruhr region, the coal mining region of Germany, which was another place that my region was linked with, they didn't actually have any universities in the Ruhr. They have them in the the larger region, places like Cologne, very ancient universities, but not in the Ruhr itself, because again, like in my region overall, it was more vocational schools and practical training for people to work in the industries, and then the coal industry's phasing out, the steel industry's phasing out. So in the 1960s, 1970s, they create universities, and their universities are a mixture of training students, but also research and development. And if you look in Britain and Manchester University, Salford University, there's a whole conglomerations of universities in the northwest of England that have done exactly the same. And Manchester has revitalised so much better than my region of the northeast of England, where universities didn't play that role. And there's been, active efforts to, think about place-based regeneration. And if I look around the United States, I've spent a lot of time over the last year plus, and I was looking into this when I was writing the book, but COVID hit, so I couldn't do a lot of the research. I've gone to lots of places in the Midwest. Pittsburgh is an obvious place with both the University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon, but things, places you might not think about, like Grand Rapids, Michigan, or Erie, Pennsylvania, where universities and community colleges have been set up. And in Germany, what's also interesting, you hear a lot about political polarization now with the rise of this Alternative for Germany, Alternative for Deutschland right-wing party in the eastern Germany. The Germans have discovered they have less political polarization and, again, more generation of jobs in places with some kind of educational institution. The places where they've got the most extremism are the places where it's kind of an educational desert. They've got schools, but they haven't got any kind of training organizations or entities. And so it could be a 2-year college, a training college for electricians. It could be anything. And the Germans are now actively trying to invest in building up their educational capacity. And remember, of course, this is all state-generated rather than private institutions. And it's a mixture of the local region, the local municipality, and then the national government, and then businesses. This is not just all top-down, it's also grassroots and civic groups investing very heavily in these. They're also doing a lot of outreach to expand access to education, particularly to first generation, because they're worried about social mobility in Germany. And there's a lot of thinking about that now in Britain. And also looking to here in the United States, because there are actually some pretty good examples. So if we look around, the United States now, the places that are in the most trouble, the most left behind, are those that are also educational deserts. They might have had a liberal arts college, but they haven't had a lot of investment in research capacity. A lot of liberal arts schools that only, basically produce students rather than research are closing because it's, very hard to keep them going. And I think that we should, spend a lot of time thinking, as was done in the 1860s, the 1890s here about the public land grant universities, about investment in public education, but of all kinds. And I also think, it shouldn't just be elite education, but vocational extension schools, different ways in which we can expand access to education with practical training involved in this as well, because that's what's happening in other countries. And in most of Europe now, they're really thinking about that. And, and eventually they might get an edge. And we kind of seem to be stepping back, rather than forward, even though we'd be building on ideas that were already generated here in the 1860s onwards.
Your observations about universities as catalysts for economic development, I think, deserve further conversation on this campus, and I hope that we're able to talk about that going forward. I know that the audience is eager to hear a little bit about your time in the Trump White House and as part of the administration, and so I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about first the Trump administration's foreign policy and how it put the U.S. in peril on the world stage, and how successful has the Biden administration been in rolling back those decisions to be a more active partner on the world stage?
Well, look, there's always a lot more continuity in foreign policy from administration to administration than anybody really wants to admit. So beyond, sort of the obvious things that everybody was seeing, there was a lot of things that were really kind of remaining the same behind the scenes. What was really different about President Trump was really President Trump and the personalization of foreign policy. So, much of our foreign relations was done through the prism of his relationships with world leaders, and if he wasn't interested in a world leader, there wasn't, much attention to a particular issue. So when we think about Russia and Putin, it was more about how he felt about Putin rather than how he felt about Russia. And, as somebody who was very image conscious and doesn't want to be, seen in the company of the weak, he tended to want to focus in his interactions with the people who he saw as the strong men. Now, it wasn't just strong men, President Xi, President Putin, Orban, of Hungary, for example. It was also people with status. He was obsessed about Queen Elizabeth, for example, and the Pope. Very different people, but it was that kind of status issue. And that, in of itself was the problematic issue, because it meant that a lot of issues were, kind of distorted through a particular prism. I do want to say, though, that there's a couple of areas where Trump actually, because of his rather unconventional, let's just say it mildly, approach to things, deserves a lot more credit than he got. One of which is on North Korea. And Dakota might be, well aware of this. We were in some considerable nuclear peril when he came into office. Obama pretty much warned Trump that Kim Jong-un was about to blast off a weapon, somewhere in our direction, Guam, Micronesia, maybe Hawaii. You might remember the horrible scare in Hawaii when the siren went off. And because Trump has this, personalized relationship, remember the whole, weird back and forth about Little Rocket Man and Kim Jong-un. He went from sort of baiting him to embracing him. And, that whole time, we didn't have an episode with him shooting off a rocket. And maybe, it takes that kind of slightly madman approach, to kind of deal with somebody like Kim Jong-un. And you might remember Nixon. Henry Kissinger would always say, he's a madman. You've got to be really careful about how he handles things. It was a shtick. It was an act. And I think, part of that with Trump was an act with Kim Jong-un. But, I suppose one could say at what cost. We didn't have a nuclear agreement with North Korea, and there's lots of problems, and Kim Jong-un is shooting off rockets all over the place, and now, joining forces with Putin. But for a while there, there was that, let's just say, that issue was off the table for a while. Other issues came onto it. There was also then the Middle East. I mean, he jettisoned, of course, all of the U.S. policy of trying to embrace the Palestinians, and kind of cut to the chase, decided this was, not going to work on, and just went straight for Israel, basically brokering peace with the Gulf and with other Arab states, and pushed the Palestinians to one side. And of course, the Biden administration hasn't shifted that. But as you were suggesting, what the Biden administration has tried to do is go back to multilateralism. Trump would actually show up at international events, but just to kind of work the rope line and to schmooze. He wasn't really very serious about it. He kept threatening to pull out of NATO. He wasn't saying anything about NATO that people hadn't said before him, like Obama or, Secretary Gates, who, of course, went over from, one administration to the next about our NATO counterparts should be paying their 2% and, paying their, defense support. But it was the way that he was saying it. And of course, we know, and Ambassador Bolton has said many times, that he was threatening to pull out of NATO, which of course then undermined, the value of Article 5 and the solidarity. But look, international affairs is always, very tricky. He did completely undermine by, much of this kind of capriciousness, the view of the United States among many of our allies and partners in other states as well, by pulling out of so many accords. We can all debate the merits of these accords, but these are agreements and treaties are things that we committed to. Going back again, I mentioned in passing the commitment to the Ukrainians, which was the Budapest Agreement in 1994. If the rest of the world thinks that every time a new government comes along, we're just going to tear up, agreements that we've just made, then we're not looked at as a very reliable partner. And the biggest impact that Trump had on the rest of the world is just thinking, well, the United States, you just can't rely on us anymore. And all the questions that I got while I was in Germany, beyond people wanting to know salacious details about this issue or that issue, or what really happened there or what really happened here, was, can we rely on the United States? What's going to happen in 2024? And I would always say, well, look, should be in any case taking care of your own security and diversifying. That's been the message, going back several administrations, which is you need to step up here, particularly on Ukraine. It's a European security issue. But we are now looking at as the weak link, the unreliable partner. And also people are questioning our leadership. And that's what happened at the UN General Assembly meetings recently. Remember when President Zelensky and then President Biden were addressing the hall, it was half full. Because people do not see the United States as playing a reliable role in international leadership, which might please isolationists. But if you think about so many of the issues that we depend on, the strength of the dollar, our ability to sell our produce at the best possible price, that also depends on the power of our own diplomacy. So even issues that we might think of just of domestic import do require US leadership. And there is movements in the rest of the world. We can be skeptical about the likelihood of their success to move away from the dollar, to isolate the United States in various international and regional affairs. And I was telling some of the students that we've spent over the last 2 years at Brookings, last year and a half, having dialogues with counterparts in places that we don't normally, talk to, think tanks in Brazil, for example, in India. And it's been really sobering. They really don't like us. And also being British as well, they really don't like me. You've got the British Empire on top of all of this, and every sin that Britain has ever. I feel like, oh God, where are we going to go with this conversation? But there is this real desire everywhere else in the world not to get caught between the United States and China. We haven't really talked about China here. Kind of worries about where the United States is heading, and a lot of skepticism about our role in the world and our abilities to shape institutions moving forward. So we're at a real inflection point.
We're at the point of the program where it's an opportunity for the audience to participate. and we have microphones on either side of the ballroom. We'd like to give preference to University of Idaho or Washington State University students. And so if you have a question in mind and would like to move to either microphone, and if there are no student questions, of course, we welcome the community to participate. But if you're a student, if for the benefit of our guest, if you could introduce yourself, tell us your first name, where you're from, and what you're studying at the University of Idaho, I think that's a helpful perspective. And so once we have potential questioners in place, I'll call on you in turn. And if you could please keep your questions short and direct. And so we have one here on the right, please.
And I've already had a great opportunity several times today and last night to meet with students, so yeah. I know they've got questions.
Yeah, so please.
Yeah.
My name is Johnny Rehorn. I'm from Boise, Idaho. I'm studying history here. I guess my question would be, with so many problems occurring with Russia recently and in the past, what do you think the future of American and Russian relations really is? I know I read up a little bit on you that you've discussed some of the similarities you found between Russian and American society. Do you think maybe some of those similarities and differences are playing into this seemingly constant conflict we come into with Russia, at least in the past 100 years?
No, that's a great question, and it's obviously very sobering thinking we're sitting here in Moscow, Idaho, which obviously probably wasn't named Moscow because we were feeling negative, about Russia, back in the day when people decided to name it. It was obviously seen as a sign of prestige, and actually there are 7 places, I think it is 6 or 7 places in the United States, including in my current home state of Maryland, that are named Moscow. So, obviously we seem to be positive. You don't usually call your city something you don't like. Anyway. And, it is, it's interesting you said 100 years, because I would say kind of our relationships got off to a rocky start with the intervention in what was then the Soviet Union. Just after the Russian Empire, we sent a bunch of cavalry into the Russian Far East. That probably wasn't the best kind of foot to go forward on, that kind of very brief period. Look, I think there are a lot of similarities, even historically, between the United States and Russia in the kind of the territorial expansion, and incorporating, more and more peoples. There are lots of ties between Native American and Siberian peoples. In fact, I was just in Boise last week, and there was a lady behind me in one of these complexes in downtown Boise, which you probably know, the Jump Complex, where there's a slide. And she was putting her son down the slide, and I heard her speaking to someone, but she was speaking English, but her accent was very distinctive. And I spoke to her, and she was from Kamchatka, and she was native from Kamchatka. And I thought, wow, that's kind of amazing. And she'd sort of flown in via Alaska. And of course, Alaska was Russian until 1861. And in fact, there was a Russian colony in California until 1825. I'm sure people from California have been to Fort Ross. There are also Russian Orthodox monasteries. We've got long ties. We, expanded all in the, same directions in the similar time frame. The structures, the political structures, are very different, but we've got a lot of things in common in many respects. But as you say, we've been having a rough time of it in the relationship. I think that part of the issue really gets to having a full understanding and of appreciation of where the other country is at. In Russian and what was Soviet, American studies, it's very superficial. Most of the kind of Russian scholars of America know very little about the US and tend to mirror image, and we do the same thing. We do a lot of mirror imaging. Part of the issue that we've had is, look, we are still an empire here in the United States, and Britain is an empire. Ask the Irish and the Welsh, and I'm Scottish in large part, but I'm also Irish and Welsh. Scotland wasn't really conquered by the English. You might remember all that kind of history, but the Scots had a lot of bad debt after trying to build up a colony. And some of you probably know this history in the Darien Gap, which is now the kind of the Panama Canal zone, and they were all into having their own colonies, and then lost 40% of the national wealth and needed a bailout from English bankers and had to have parliamentary oversight. Sounds very modern, but that's how they became part of the empire. But Britain lost a large overseas empire, but apart from Ireland, hasn't had to deal with, the complete, collapse of what it thinks of as a state. But I have to, say that when Scotland was going through the independence referendum in 2014, I had a bit of a, little panic attack, which made me then, kind of think about all of the, the people from Putin and others in Russia who started to, wonder who they were when, the Soviet Union fell apart. And that's kind of part of the problem. I don't think we fully appreciated the mental maps that people have of their world. Now, there's a debate here, I understand, going on in Oregon, kind of east of the Cascades, people wanting to join Idaho. That would be a kind of, I presume it wouldn't be at gunpoint and, would be an administrative shift. Crimea being shifted to Ukraine was an administrative shift, by the way, in, a larger state. But if, the United States fell apart, there might be some, conflicts here about who belongs, where. And of course, there was a lot of fighting for Ireland to become a free state and a republic, and it went on for years and years. And it's taken a long time, but most Brits now think of Ireland as independent. But it took 90 years for the Queen to show up, basically in Dublin, give a kind of a form of apology. It was a visual apology in what she was wearing, and her showing up, not actual. We're terribly sorry, about what happened over all the centuries. And in the case of Russia, I think this is part of the issue. We didn't fully understand that there would be, for some people like Putin and others, a complete inability to deal with the collapse of the state. So Russia lost in its mind, and people of Putin's cohort, a state. Well, Ukrainians, of course, gained a state. Now they're kind of fighting, to keep that state. So it's not condoning that, but we didn't fully process it. We also didn't handle the collapse of the Soviet Union in a way that would have been maybe conducive to different relationships. And I just want to talk about this for a moment, because we recognize Russia as the continuating state of the Soviet Union, or the successor state. So we then didn't think about Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Armenia, Azerbaijan in any meaningful way. And we didn't think about how those relationships would play out over time. We weren't very attentive to it. We also talked about 25 million Russians in the near abroad. Well, we talk about George Washington and everybody else as English, millions of English people in the near abroad, the collapse of the British Empire. We didn't. So we actually also then fed in, to Russia's claims on Russian speakers. Just because you speak Russian doesn't make you a Russian. 90% of people in Kazakhstan spoke Russian, but 90% of people in Kazakhstan weren't Russian. A very large number of them were Kazakhs, and now 50% of people in Kazakhstan speak Kazakh. But it's as a second language as well as a first language. We didn't unpack all of that and think about it either. So I think part of the problem in the relationship is not really understanding what we're doing, just making a whole load of assumptions, and also perpetuating things. My sister is now a refugee from Brexit in Spain. She's a Spanish citizen. She's an English person left in, the near abroad after the, kind of Britain pulling out of, and she had to make a decision. So now she's a Spanish citizen. And that's, so many people, Russian speakers became citizens. That's why the Russians can't get their head around Ukrainians, because people like Zelensky spoke Russian, but he's not Russian. And, we've kind of fed into this as well. So, basically, part of the root of the problems in relationship is us not doing our homework, not being attentive, but they weren't doing theirs either. And now, when we start to think forward, we're going to have to address all of these issues. It's going to be very difficult to get a new relationship with Russia. There's going to be after a lot of reckoning and a lot of accounting, for what's obviously happened in this brutal and horrific war, but also of a lot of the mistakes that we made in the past in the way that we approach things. We just sort of assumed that overnight this would all be, transformed into, something else, and it wasn't. And the Germans are in a state of absolute existential shock from all of this, because they never thought at all that anything like this would happen. And they assumed that their guilt from World War II was to Russia. They hadn't even thought also of Ukrainians. And now they're getting double guilt, because now they feel they neglected Ukraine. They've got 1.5 million Ukrainian refugees. And of course, if they'd listened to Tim Snyder's lectures or read his book Bloodlands, they would have realized that most of the bloodletting during World War II was actually in Ukraine, in Belarus, and in Poland, of course, and in other states. And many of the people, the millions who died in World War II in the Soviet Union, were not just Russians. There might have been Russian speakers, but they were from all of these different groups.
Thank you for that question, which could be the subject of an interdisciplinary seminar next semester.
Here at the University of Idaho.
Right here. Yeah. So we'll continue that conversation. Let's switch over to this side with your question, please.
Hello, my name is Heather. I'm studying philosophy at WSU, and I was asking about, when you were talking about labor relations, I'm paraphrasing here, but you said that Russia looks like the ghost of Christmas future for the US and for other countries, and I was wondering what similarities you're finding that are leading you to think that, and if you could elaborate on it.
Yeah, and I mean, that's obviously from Charles Dickens. I mean, I can't assume that everyone's read Charles Dickens. When you grow up as a British school kid, you're forced to read Charles Dickens, Christmas carols, classic, staple at Christmas. And it's always on the telly, in a kind of movie. And remember, the ghost of Christmas future doesn't have to happen. It's more kind of a sort of a spectre that, could happen if certain conditions or trajectories continue. And the thing that's been worrying me most is basically the mixture, kind of a toxic mix of populism and the fetishization of a leader. And, I obviously come from a different tradition in the UK with, prime ministers. And actually, God, the UK has gone through so many prime ministers, you can't keep up. In the last couple of years, it's like every 5 minutes there's a new one, which is unusual for Britain and the UK, to be frank. But, there's a different nature of politics there. There's more than two parties now. There's been a kind of it's more of a sort of messy European-style coalition, kind of arrangements than anything else. That's changed a lot. But in most of the countries where there's a presidential system, you've seen much more of an accruing of executive power. And you see that in France, you see it in Israel, we can, or you can see it in places like Hungary where it's not really a president, but you're growing more into a kind of a single leader position. You've seen it in China, where the Communist Party, though is still powerful, has been eroded by President Xi in the creating of more of a, this is the age of strongmen, as we keep talking about. And there's Gideon Rachman from the FT's book about that very title of the age of the strongman. And I would argue that, I've done a lot of work on Putin over the years, that Putin is the first populist president because he comes into office in 2000, or really December 1999, on the eve of the millennium, where Russia has had a really rough decade, from the collapse of the Soviet Union, losing the state, trying to kind of come to terms with itself. And he comes back essentially saying he's going to make Russia great again. And at first he's focused on the international arena, but then he spreads out into the international arena, and of course the presidency becomes more and more authoritarian over time. He reduces the power of the parliament, he reduces all the checks and balances to the point that all there is in Russia is the president and the constitution, and he's like a super-empowered constitutional monarch, essentially. And it was his old law professor from Leningrad State University, as it was at the time, St. Petersburg University, the law faculty, Anatoly Sobchak, who actually drew up that constitution in the 1990s. And I was, as a research assistant to the group who were working on this, there's some people from Harvard, Professor Lawrence Tribe, who were involved in a kind of an advisory group, and I was the person who translated a lot of this for them. So, I got to meet all of these people in one of my younger guises. And they were thinking about a constitutional monarchy because Sobchak had studied the efforts under the Tsars to create a constitutional monarchy and was of the belief that the monarchy, the Tsarist system would have been retained had they managed to create a, kind of a constitutional monarchy with a few checks and balances and a Russian parliament. But really what has happened under Putin is just kind of getting rid of all those checks and balances and just creating a monarch out of the presidency. And you'll have heard that some of the people around Putin say there is no Russia without Putin. He's become the symbol of the state. And that's our problem here in the United States over time, which is not at all what the founding fathers had in mind. I mean, the president was the commander-in-chief because that's who George Washington was, of course, with the Wars of Independence and, the Revolutionary Wars. He was the commander-in-chief and then, gets selected and elected as the president. But it's also the head of state. And, it's not just under Trump, but, successively, presidents have taken accrued more executive power in the United States. And there's a real slippery slope in that regard. And, I think that our institutions, getting back to, what Dakota is saying, have got, more and more under siege over time. Again, this is cumulative over a long period of time, but has become particularly acute. And we in the United States are now in a constitutional crisis. Not we're heading towards, we are in one, because it's very hard to keep our institutions up to date. We're dealing with an 18th century constitutional a set of arrangements. So is the UK, by the way. So this is not something that's unique to the United States. We see constitutional crises in Israel. We see in France. There's also an issue. Macron is the leader of a movement, not of a party. He cannibalized the old socialist party. He's not socialist at all. And there's now a risk that Marine Le Pen will be the successor to Macron, and she holds something that used to be called basically the National Front. It's now the National Rally. But you see more of these populist leaders emerging in these situations where representative democracy, mainstream parties have started to break down, and there's more of a focus on executive power, because people get frustrated with the complexity of democracy and want to cut to the chase. So that's kind of basically what I was talking about, because Russia did not have to end up in exactly this situation. It wasn't inevitable. Now, once you have a president who was from the KGB, perhaps yes, but kind of it wasn't inevitable that Russia would end up exactly on this path.
Let's go back to this side for another question, and we're going to try and get through the remaining students.
Yeah, I'll try and make shorter answers, sorry.
Who are standing.
Okay, I think I got a short one. So I'm Michael, I'm studying law here at U of I. My question is what are your thoughts on the future of the Black Sea grain deal? After the killing of the Russian commander of the Black Sea Fleet, will that change in leadership potentially change the outcome of that deal, or?
The Russians have already abandoned the Black Sea grain deal, which might actually be one of the reasons the Ukrainians have actually taken this step to decide to shell the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet. You probably have heard that the Ukrainians, and let's just see what happens now, have been trying to create their own corridor with ships hugging the coast, coming in through the Bosphorus Straits, and then hugging the Bulgarian-Romanian coastlines to get to Odessa. We'll have to see whether the Russians decide for revenge on trying to, shell those ships. And look, this is extraordinarily dangerous, getting back to our point of on the edge, because you probably have been following that the Danube delta that the Ukrainians have also been trying to use as another passage for their grain is very narrow. In fact, it's only 200 meters across in some of the places, and so across from Romania. And some of the damage that's been done to the Ukrainian ports has also been done to the Romanians. The Romanians have been trying to keep this quiet because of the obvious implications of what might transpire from this. There was two different parts getting to your question about the Black Sea grain deal. There was a separate agreement for Russia to export its grain, and then there was a separate one for Russia to allow Ukrainian grain to be exported. And the Russians were very keen to keep their grain being exported and just take Ukraine off the map, but not just grain, but fuel, food oils, sunflower oil, etc., and other commodities. So I would suspect at this particular juncture, again, we have to watch this space, that the Russians will find a kind of a way of pounding this even more. So there then will be the kind of question about what should we all do about this? Because the Danube Delta is an international waterway. The Ukrainian ships, kind of hugging kind of the coastline. They're not out there in international waters in the Black Sea. And I think this is going to be a real test, for us now. And, and also we'll have to, see how the Russians are going to handle this. Because, obviously the export of grain has global ramifications. The Chinese have been buying a lot of the Ukrainian grain. It's not just the humanitarian shipments. The Turks had a huge investment in the continuation of the Black Sea grain deal because it was going to Turkish ports, rather than to other ports. This is going to be, I can't say exactly how this is going to play out, but I think this is something to watch very closely. And I don't know whether it was confirmed, but perhaps you saw more than I did, that they had killed the commander. The Russians, before I came in, he hadn't said anything, but I think the Ukrainians wouldn't have said that had they not been confident. But yeah, definitely world on an edge at the moment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So back here for your question, and then 2 short ones on the far side. So please.
Hello, my name is Noah, and I'm an international studies student here at the University of Idaho. And you were mentioning the importance of training and education, higher education, on really like keeping the government honest in a way. We saw in my readings of Russia post the fall of the Soviet Union, and even slightly before it, there was a steady decrease in vocational training, college, all that. Do you think that sort of led, and the brain drain that resulted from even the people that could get training, that resulted in, you know, the things that we're seeing in Russia today? And could we extrapolate that to a country like India, which also faces a lot of problems with brain drain and is also experiencing problems like large amounts of Hindu nationalism with their sort of strongman president? Yeah.
No, I mean, it's a really great question. I mean, on the Russian front, I can, speak to that in some detail as well, because it's also the nature of the educational system. So, in the 1990s, there was a great move to set up, European and US-style humanities education. So in St. Petersburg, the humanities, European Humanities University, to get more kind of critical thinking and, very similar programs to what we have here. So it's not just STEM, but there's the ability to do, coursework on a whole host of other issues. And steadily that's been eroded, and most of those institutions have now closed down. And, Putin has, most recently circumscribed the teaching of history. There's been, a very ideological focus to this, something we have to bear in mind here because it's happening here in the United States as well, the politicization of education. Books are being banned up the wazoo in Russia, including, books by many of my colleagues. People are being imprisoned for teaching the wrong courses. This is another one, that I didn't say about my worries about, ghost of Christmas future. People, basically denouncing, their teachers. This has been happening for some time. And, when I read about, parents and kids denouncing their teachers for teaching a thing, I just think of Stalin's Russia. And, what slippery slope are we doing there where, people would denounce their neighbor because they wanted their apartment, or denounce the neighbor because they fancied their wife, or denounce the neighbor because they wanted their fur coat. We're heading in that kind of, directions here as well, and banning books and burning books and all the rest of it. Russia's had that in the past, in the Stalinist era in particular, but over the course of, the last several years under Putin, we've had more and more of that stifling, of education. So it's not just the brain drain of people leaving it, but people's, entire brains being squeezed and, ending up in jail for, saying and teaching the wrong thing. In terms of the actual brain drain itself, that is consequential. Many of the innovations in Silicon Valley have been from Russian speakers, not just from Russia, by the way, but also from Ukraine and elsewhere. Sergey Brin and others, kind of coming here because they got stifled in their ability, to kind of push forward with their research or to just be entrepreneurial in the Russian context. And then since the war's broken out, you've got, 1.5 million Russians leaving, and they're all the young guys. Ukrainian refugees, by the way, are mostly women and children. So the demographic impact on Ukraine, in addition to the war with the refugees, is going to be very significant. For Russia, it's young men and older men as well. Now the conscription age has gone up, and it's IT specialists, and it's the Federal Aviation Authority equivalent, and it's people from local government. And it's the best and the brightest. And although one could say there's a lot of people still leaving there, but also critical thinking and innovation is being stifled. Everything's being pushed towards the war economy. It's going to have a really negative impact on Russia over the long term, just like the Stalinist era did and World War II did. Now, some people shoot back and say, Russia, the Soviet Union still put Sputnik into space. That was the Soviet Union. It was twice the size of Russia, and it was the Kazakhs and the Armenians and the Azeris and the Ukrainians and the Belarusians and the Moldovans as well. It wasn't just the Russians. Russia is now half that size and dwindling. And we think about the casualties in Ukraine. They're very high in Russia as well. This is going to have a huge impact. This is the biggest mass casualty event created, of course, by the Russian invasion in Russia since World War II. On a country that's a fraction of the size. So it's brain drain, it's all of these issues. Now, also Russians who were trained overseas have been persecuted as well. So when you're making the comment about India, there's a lot to be concerned about, but a lot of, India is now a world leader on engineering, on pharmaceutical development, on high tech. There's still, India also has the advantage of a vast English-speaking population. And I'm not just saying that because we're all English-speaking, but it actually is very significant because, India is now, it's not just the call centers, but it's become, really a lot of center of education opportunity. There's a lot of exchanges. A lot of Indian students were studying in Kharkiv, a lot of Indian, in Ukraine, a lot of Indian students studying here. And they are, for now going back. But there is a cautionary tale and basically, helping to stimulate the economy and, all kinds of developments. And India just put a rover on the moon, which is pretty impressive. And, you might have noticed that a lot of the leading politicians in Britain, including the Prime Minister, are of Indian heritage. There's a very different possibility for India if the cautionary tale of, too much emphasis on Hindu nationalism is basically adhered to. That's the ghost of India's Christmas futures by clamping down and stifling, particular groups. That's also another lesson from Russia as well. But I think India's approach so far to its education has been very different, and there's, people kind of coming back and setting up, businesses in India just like they were in China. I mean, things can go wrong, but actually India has a lot of potential, I would say, at this moment that Russia, has squandered or maybe didn't even have earlier on.
Thank you for that question. Let's turn to our last two questioners on this side.
Yes,
please be brief.
So my question is, given the recent dispute between Poland and Ukraine based on grain and supplies, with the continuation of the war, to what extent do you expect to see conditions placed on support from European countries, or their support becoming less favorable to Ukraine as the war drags on and becomes more expensive in various different areas?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a really good question to raise, and obviously it points to a very complicated future for Ukraine and its relationships with Europe. I mean, we're all assuming that Ukraine will become a member of the European Union. I mean, the Europeans have talked about that. There's also, the discussion about bringing Ukraine into NATO, but, the European angle could be the more complicated. I've mentioned Germany several times because I was there for the last, 6 months. And the Germans are worried about the future of their own economy. And they've invested and allocated a lot of money for industrial transition. So, for example, they've set aside 40 billion euros for the transition of 80,000 miners in the Rhineland and the Lausitz in East Germany. And that's already set aside. And when I was leaving Germany, there was just a lot of concern about where were they going to find monetary resources, to think about, reconstruction of Ukraine down the line when, in the German and the European context, as I'm sure you're well aware, they set that money aside for 10, 15, 20 years. And the EU budgetary process is over a 10, 12, year period. So they can't just, turn on a euro, instead of turning on a dime, to completely start, rethinking their budget and their budget allocations. And then, as you're, rightly pointing out, you've got all the domestic politics. Poland is about to have an election. And, Polish farmers are very influential in that election. And suddenly, they're finding their crop prices depressed because Ukrainian farmers are so desperate to sell the grain that they're selling grain to middlemen, to get it out of the silos because the Russians are destroying all the silos. Something like 400 odd silos, grain silos have been destroyed. So where are they going to store the grain? It's the smaller farmers, the farmers of about 50,000 and below hectares, who are really suffering here. The larger farmers have still got a lot of money and investment there. The Ukrainians have to get their grain out. And look, we're sitting here in the wheat capital, of America. We know that, the grain has to get out so you can bring, the rest of the harvest in. And then if you can't get rid of your grain, you're not going to plant, grain for the next season with all of this infrastructure destroyed. And so, this is a disaster in many respects. But, the Poles are playing politics. It's also the same. They're pulling back on some of the weapons. And this is exactly what Putin's relying on. He's relying on politics in other European countries undermining that support for Ukraine. So you can be sure there's all kinds of Russian propaganda and disinformation pushing that along, and also in Hungary and Slovakia where there's the election. And there's sort of an assumption that this will undermine the support for Ukraine. I would say in the UK, which sounds like it might be from the UK, there's a very different view of this. That's not kind of a concern for UK farmers. In France, it's very different. In Germany, there's, as I said, there's all kinds of other worries about the allocation of budgetary resources because of their own, transition issues. But I think, there's going to have to be much more of a move on the part of the EU and Europeans at large to figure out how they're going to band together for measures to overcome all of this. We're going to have to watch all of this closely. And getting back to that other question about the Black Sea grain deal, and how the Russians are likely to react if indeed the commander of the Black Sea Fleet and other key people have been killed, there's going to be a heck of a lot of pressure on Romania and Bulgaria and other Black Sea states. There's going to be a lot more pressure on that grain, and countries like Poland and others are going to have to start addressing how they're going to deal with that, because the last things the Poles want to do is to see Ukraine fall. Because, for them, this is their fight as well. So they're, let's just say, a bit schizophrenic about the whole thing, right now, which makes it so complicated. There's no easy solutions to any of this. There's just a lot of need for very serious diplomacy and attention. But thank you very much for asking that question. And are you from the UK
yes,
originally?
I'm from Hereford.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Yeah. Nice to find another, fellow Brit in Idaho.
Let's turn to our final question, and thank you for your patience. Please go ahead.
My name is Molly Feely, and I'm an international studies and sociology student. And I was wondering what you thought about the future of the UN, given the lack of representation on the permanent members of the Security Council and the US's current unreliability in the world.
Well, in most of the world, there's actually a lot of support for the UN and various UN mechanisms. A lot of countries support the International Criminal Court. We haven't signed on to that. The International Court of Justice, the World Food Programme. I wouldn't say that any of particular interlocutors that we've had at Brookings when we've talked about these issues are particularly starry-eyed, but they don't want the United Nations to disappear. They would like UN reform, obviously the Security Council, but they would actually like to see the United States and other major players pay more attention to some of the core issues of the UN, like the Sustainable Development Goals, more economic development. They don't just want food security, they want more humanitarian assistance, they want more emphasis on helping UN member countries become more sovereign in their production of food and start making more investment in longer term food sustainability given climate change. They would like debt relief, more economic development issues overall. They would just like us to pay more attention to kind of big global issues that are of interest to them. And then that gets back to, what's the use of the United Nations Security Council? I have to say, as an original Brit, why is Britain on the Security Council? France? Well, it's just this is still the artifact of the end of World War II. And of course, we always talk about what are the countries that should be on there, and then that becomes really problematic. We were talking earlier in one of the discussions that most of the geographic constructs of the world, talking about Francophone Africa or English-speaking Africa or the Western Hemisphere, these are all our constructs. That's not how other parts of the world think about themselves. And so there would be a lot of deliberation about who would represent what group of countries. Mm-hmm. Should Nigeria have a seat? Should South Africa have a seat? Should Ghana have a seat? Should Kenya have a seat? African countries. Why should this country over that country, have a seat? There was a debate about Germany, for a long time, of the European Union, but not every European country is in the European Union. There's been the rotating idea of this. So it certainly sounds like and seems like we've got a moment where there is a demand for rethinking this, not necessarily reinventing, but of kind of rethinking this as an international institution. It's not very popular in the United States. I worked in the previous administration with people who kind of loathed the UN. Even people who had actually been ambassadors to the UN. The whole idea was that it should be dismantled. But when you, as I said, do more polling internationally, there's a great desire to see the UN reinvigorated, particularly the UN Charter. The human rights aspects of this, the international law aspects of this. So I think we're on kind of notice to really be thinking about this very seriously and to have more grassroots voices, more kind of civic group participation. These are all tall orders, but I think we're at, again, one of those inflection points in the war. That gets back to what I was saying earlier, and the war in Ukraine reveals that, where there is a demand for rethinking our institutions. So, I think that more of that pressure will continue. Next year is the UN Summit for the Future, and it'll be very interesting to see, what countries bring to the table there.
A question about the United Nations was a perfect way to end this conversation about the future of international cooperation. Thank you for that. You've been an incredibly attentive and engaged audience this evening. I hope you will stick around as we adjourn the formal part of the program and continue the conversation among yourselves, with members of the Borah Committee, and with our guests. But let's thank Dr. Fiona Hill for her time, expertise,
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
and inspiration. So.
Thank you, Kenton.
The next program in the Borah Symposium will be tomorrow, Tuesday, 12:30 p.m. in the Vandal Ballroom at the opposite side of this floor for an examination of the Kellogg-Briand Pact adapted to the nuclear age, a film tomorrow night, and then back here Wednesday at 7 for former Governor, Senator, and Interior Secretary Dirk Kempthorne for the closing plenary. So again, thank you all for being here. Good night.